Good evening and welcome to Chasing in Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host, and with us tonight is Mr. Andy Reid. That's R-E-I-D. Mr. Andy Reid, who is the superintendent of the Chelmsford Water District. And tonight's topic is PFAS, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. You can educate us as to the correct technical term, but everybody knows it as PFAS. We're going to be talking about that. A letter went out from the Chelmsford Water District recently to the Chelmsford Water District water takers, advising them of elevated levels of PFAS. This is not something that is terribly concerning at the moment because it's a very low level over the threshold, but I'm going to let Andy explain all of that to you. But before we get into the meat of the discussion, whereas Andy is a relatively new employee for the Chelmsford Water District. You've been with the district now for about a year, and he is the superintendent. He took over from Bob Doak, who retired. So could you just give us a little bit of your, a little bit of biographical sketch, your background and your credentials and so forth, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Sure. Well, thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
I am, as you said, my name's Andy Reid, and I am the superintendent for the Chelmsford Water District. I've been there for about a year. I've been in Massachusetts for over 20 years. I was a consultant doing municipal water and wastewater projects and some international projects. I hail from Maine, so I'm a University of Maine graduate.
Great. That's where my family is from.
It's a great state.
It certainly is.
And I've been, before I came to the district, I was actually the superintendent at the Wareham Fire District on Cape Cod. So similar issues and incidences down there occurred as well.
So you mentioned the fire district on Cape Cod, so that leads me to ask you, perhaps we could talk just for a minute or so about the history of the water districts in Massachusetts, specifically in Chelmsford. You mentioned fire district. So my understanding is that 100+ years ago, we had the separate water districts in Chelmsford, but they were called fire districts. So what's that all about?
Sure. So back in the 1880s, thereabouts, and this is very common in eastern Massachusetts, most of our businesses burned. Most of our businesses were wood buildings, and there was no easy way to put a fire out back in 1880 with the horses and by manpower. So the districts were established by an act of a legislature and basically became a quasi-municipal entity in the state of Massachusetts. And their main purpose back then was fire suppression.
Mm-hmm. And so from that, they evolved, because obviously they had to deal with water to some degree to accomplish that purpose, so they evolved into what we have now is the water districts.
That's correct.
And in many communities, as in Chelmsford, the districts have remained separate legal authorities. They are not part of the town government and administrative structure. So the town manager, for example, and the select board, they have absolutely no jurisdiction over the water districts. You belong to a particular water district based on your geography within the town, and if you are a water taker in that water district, you are actually a voter. I mean, you vote for the water district commissioners and so forth, so you participate in that way. So that's a little bit of the history and the way we're set up in Chelmsford. So let's get into the discussion at hand now, which is PFAS. So I'm going to let you run with it. You have some materials that we'll be going through, and I am certainly not the expert. I would not even say that I'm reasonably knowledgeable. So we'll let you go.
Well, we're all learning as we go.
Mm-hmm.
So PFAS has been around probably since the 1950s, give or take. It was produced by several major manufacturers. One was DuPont, one was 3M. Those are notable ones. And what they were looking for at the time was a compound that was basically non-stick, something that we could put on packages and clothing and such that would be waterproof and basically would kind of separate you from the environment. So fast forward here about 60 or 70 years, and after many decades of use, it's no surprise that PFAS is showing up almost everywhere. It shows up in our drinking water, it shows up in our wastewater, it shows up in the air, and all in minute amounts. And we're talking about parts per trillion. And to give you a feel, a part per trillion is roughly 1 drop of water in about 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're not talking about a lot of material here or concentration. But what they have found out is that this material does tend to bioaccumulate. So we do have some, when we consume it.
It builds up inside of you.
Absolutely. So it can build up, and it takes a while for it to leave your body. So some of the health problems that kind of put this on DEP's radar, or EPA's radar specifically, was if you're exposed to significant amounts of this over the lifetime, this is not one acute dose, but say over 80 or 90 or 100 years, they see the following effects. So you can see increased cholesterol, you can see changes in liver enzymes, you can see, and this is a big one for today, a decreased vaccine response in children. You can see a risk of high blood pressure, a small decrease in infant birth weight, as well as an increase in kidney or testicular cancer. So there are some concerns about it. Again, what I would highlight, at least for the district, is we are regulated at 20 parts per trillion. That's what we call the maximum contaminant level. That's an average over a 3-month period. And so the district recently exceeded that over at the Crooked Springs plant.
Okay, and you have a number of, you have more than one water treatment plant for the district.
We certainly do. Yeah.
So you did send out an advisory letter, and that's what I would call it. This is not I would not call this a danger, runaway type letter. This is merely an advisory to advise that for this particular reporting period, you had exceeded the quarterly average by a very small amount, it looks like.
Correct.
Okay. So what the allowable is 20 parts per trillion, and you reported in at 21 parts per trillion.
Correct.
Okay. So one of the things that was not, I think the letter was pretty comprehensive, but one of the things that it did not address was for the resident getting this letter.
Sure.
Most people don't know which water treatment plant they get their water source from. So I'm going to guess that you probably had a lot of phone calls.
We've had hundreds of phone calls.
Hundreds of phone calls.
Which is good. So we have an active population.
So if you do another one of these, you're going to probably reframe that, I would say, right? Or is there any way you can do that meaningfully to get that information out?
I wish we could. So some of this that you see in front of you is called a public notice.
All right.
And that is dictated by the state, what we put out. If I could have most of the users visualize the town in their mind, and if you drew a line that went through the center of town, north to south, basically we have 2 pressure zones. So the west is Crooked Springs. The east is mainly River Neck. That's what the 2 supply sources are.
Okay, that makes sense. Geographically, that seems to make sense, yeah.
So if you are in the west, you are mainly in Crooked Springs supply. The problem is those 2 pressure zones are interconnected, and sometimes the water intermixes. So by law, we have to put the notice out to everybody.
Okay, I see that. Yeah, and that's and I do know that there is also interconnectivity with the other water districts.
There is.
So you're able to do that as well. So that's interesting. So what should be the response? Somebody, a Chelmsford Water District customer gets this letter and understands that that there may be some cause for concern. So
Sure.
what should the water taker do?
Well, I would say generally for the average person, the risk is pretty low. However, if you are a person who is in a high-risk category, let's say if you're a nursing mother or someone who may have some issues health-wise, what we would say is we would not recommend that you drink the water. We'd say we have a list of bottled water suppliers on our website. You can go there. These are suppliers that test for PFAS, so you know that the water is PFAS-free or low PFAS. We would recommend that you use that as your drinking water. The water otherwise is safe for skin, human contact, washing your dishes, bathing. That's all okay. But if you're at a high-risk group, we'd say potentially look at getting another water source, or you can get a carbon filter that's been approved by the National Sanitation Foundation, NSF, and their standard for that is NSF Standard 53. Basically what it is, it's a cartridge with carbon in it, and that would remove the PFAS and PFOA.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So we have a fairly new refrigerator, and we get our drinking water, and also makes ice cubes. I think most people probably know what I'm talking about here. And the source obviously is the Water District water supply. Now, I have to change the filter, and and I believe it's carbon. Do you know, or is it possible that that filter that I use in that refrigerator, will that mitigate the PFAS to some degree, or is that not a fair question to ask you because I'm not giving you the brand of filter?
So the latter is true. What I would say, if it has some carbon, it probably will remove some.
Some, okay.
So in that regard, it's good. But if it does not have the NSF standard on it, so if you buy it in the box and if it doesn't say approved by NSF Standard 53, then there's no guarantee that it's going to remove it to a certain level.
All right, so folks, I'm writing that down because I won't remember it. So when I go home, I'm going to, we have an extra filter. We usually have one in stock when the other one wears out. I will check the box and we'll see if it's NSF standard, if it's done to the NSF standard. So that's something I think people can do. Now, there are other mitigation strategies that people can use. Again, I'm certainly not very knowledgeable on this subject, but just reading some of the chatter on Facebook. One person said that they had put in a reverse osmosis system. So maybe you could explain what that is.
Yeah,
if you know.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
So what I would tell people is if you go to NSF's website and search under that standard, it will give you a list of all the companies and products that have been approved by them that would remove PFAS and PFOA to that standard. One of those products, as you referenced, is reverse osmosis. And all that is it's a membrane. And what it does is basically separate the contaminant from the water. So there's a process of which it does that I'm not going to get into here. But what you do is you get pure water on one side, and the other side of the membrane we have something called reject, which is all your concentrated minerals and PFAS and organics and whatever's in your water. It works very well. It's a little expensive to run. As you can imagine, they're generally run at high pressure. And the other problematic part with reverse osmosis is you have to do something with that reject water. So most of the time what our residents are likely to do is put that water in the wastewater, and now that potentially becomes a problem for the town. So we generally don't recommend that. We would recommend that you try to stick with something that's carbon-based, and that usually goes to the landfill or gets incinerated.
Now, typically, you want to mitigate this to the greatest extent possible as a supplier, as the supplier of water. So where is the Center Water District now in terms of mitigation, filtration, whatever process however you wish to describe it, relative to the removal of PFAS?
So the district started early on this process. We started taking advantage of some grants. So we did some early monitoring and those results are on our website. That was even before the state had implemented the MCL. And it looked like we were going to be close. So if you look at our results, we're skimming around 20, give or take. So the district took advantage of another grant, so we started a pilot test. So the pilot test is a small-scale column. In this case, it was about 6 feet tall, and it was about a foot or a foot and a half in diameter. And we tested 3 or 4 different medias to see which one would work best for removing PFAS and PFOA. So we looked at carbon, and we looked at 2 or 3 other ion exchange medias. And that's wrapping up this month, and it looks like one of the ion exchange medias is the best process for taking it out of our water. So the next step is basically we would have to build an addition to the Crooked Springs plant. That would be something that would be coming before the voters to approve, because there's funding that would be part of that. And we would also be looking at taking advantage of the recent infrastructure bill that the federal government has come up with. So we think we're a good candidate to take advantage of some of those funds as well.
That's good. So typically, well, obviously you have to, you have filtration systems in place anyway, notwithstanding the PFAS situation, and you've had that for years. So to upgrade or to add on, and I don't want to peg you for a specific number, but can you give us just a very rough idea of what something like that might cost?
We call it order of magnitude.
Okay.
So we don't have design documents. It's not like I'm coming to you and say I want a Ford F-150. So these things are generally somewhat custom and not off the shelf. So keep that in mind.
Now that makes sense, because it would make sense to me that different areas of the state would have different levels of problem, and the mitigation would be based on that.
So order of magnitude for all in, construction, design, permits, we're looking somewhere between $5 and $10 million to put that addition on.
Okay. And over what time period would that occur?
So basically construction is about a 2-year period.
Okay.
So we would be going for funding this year. If it's approved, as well as potentially getting some of that federal funding, I would say we're roughly 3 years out before the tap is actually turned on.
Okay. Now, we have 2 other water districts in town, and I don't want to really get into a protracted discussion about what they are or not doing, but just from a very high level, they also have this problem. And is there anything that you can do as the Center Water District in terms of coordinating information, or just getting together to discuss the problem? Are there any common solutions that you folks would embark upon?
Yeah, I mean that's always an interesting question, because you have, and this is common for all Eastern Massachusetts, when you have multiple governments in one town.
It's not easy.
There's a lot of cooperation, if you can believe that. So generally, we do talk to both of our sister districts. We do work with them. We share information, and at times when they need it, we share water or resources. So anything that we would learn would be open book for them. And if it would help them, we'd be more happy than to share that information with them.
That's good to know, and I know the folks in the other districts, and I'm sure that the same is true. If they had any information that they felt the other district water takers in town would benefit from, I'm sure they'd be forthcoming and they would share that as well. The North District, of course, has been in the forefront because of concern about the source of the PFAS coming from the Richardson Road area. But in talking with folks at the state level who are quite knowledgeable about this, they seem to indicate that that single source is unlikely, that the PFAS would be coming from other sources, and perhaps as far away as Westford, for example. So any mitigation efforts obviously would have to take into account multiple sources of this problem, not just 1 or 2 that may appear on the surface to be problematic. So now, relative to the PFAS at for Center and Stony Brook, Have you folks identified a major source or contributing sources?
I wish we could give you an affirmative.
I'm glad I like your honesty. You know, if you don't know the answer, say so. But you can expand upon that.
What I can tell you, and this is limited information, is like I said, in the report, the public notice shows that it is common everywhere. We do notice that the Stony Brook watershed in particular seems to be a little bit higher. We know that there's industry in the past that's been there. Otherwise, I can't tell you anything more than that. What I can tell you what the district has done on a more global basis, we have joined a class action suit that's nationwide, and we hope to hear within the next year or so what the outcome of that class action suit is.
So this correctly can be categorized as this is not a town-specific or even a region-specific problem.
Correct.
This is obviously a statewide problem because we see it in the local news, but it's also a national problem. So relative to other parts of the state and other parts of the country, how are we faring in terms of the criticality of this issue?
Well, what I can tell you is the levels that we see here generally are not as high as what they see in other areas.
Okay.
So if you were at an area that was maybe closer, and this is rule of thumb, there are exceptions, so don't take it as gospel.
Of course.
But if you're in an area that was closer to a manufacturing industry that was using a PFAS product, there's a good possibility that that's going to show up in that local environment. So take, for example, there's a recent incident up in southern New Hampshire, and I won't name companies or names, but one company was using a PFAS product or PFOA product, and they were burning their waste, and what happened is that contaminant went in the air and then deposited in the local area. So they're dealing with that issue now locally in that community.
So that's something, and you said that at the beginning of the show. You talked a little bit about airborne problem, which I guess until you mentioned it now, I guess I really wasn't aware of that either. I mean, we've been so focused on the drinking water and so forth. So depending on the source of the PFAS and the processes that were used by whatever company, if we're talking industrial situations here, it could have been airborne and then moved and then settled, and of course would wind up in your water supply, especially if your main water supply is reservoir. I would think that would be an issue. We don't have that problem in Chelmsford. Most of our stuff comes from wells.
Correct.
So at this point, the PFAS gets into the ground. Now I know, following the North Chelmsford situation rather closely, it was initially thought that a lot of this may have come from fire suppressant material that was used, fire departments and you know, road operations and so forth, as it leached into the ground. So is that proven to be? Do you think that's right, or is that would we consider that a major contaminant source, or is that just a contributing source?
I mean, I don't know much about the North Chelmsford issue, so I can't really comment to it.
Well, I shouldn't have framed it that way. This really wasn't a North Chelmsford specific question, but I'm just using that as an example.
Sure.
But it sounds to me like, from what you said, that it would appear to me to be more of an issue where we're talking about industrial contamination, where water sources may be located next to either current or past industrial operations that use PFAS. I mean, I think we're all aware, certainly over the last 60 or 70 years, we've become much more environmentally aware. I'm almost 75 years old, and I can tell you that when I was a teenager and changing the oil in my car, I didn't think twice about dumping the used oil down the storm drain.
Sure.
And I'm ashamed to say it. But I think if you talk to other people my age that used to work on their cars, they'd tell you the same thing. We did not understand. We did not know we were doing anything wrong. It never occurred to us. And of course, one of the great things that's happened over the last 50 years, I'd say starting in the mid-60s anyway, is the awareness that has come about of things that we have to be concerned about relative to our environment. How do our actions impact negatively the environment around us? And we've all, I think, over the last 50 years, got a much better awareness of what our actions mean and what the consequences are. And unfortunately, I can remember when the Teflon pans came out. I think I was in high school, okay? And this was great. I mean, you could fry an egg and you didn't have to put the grease and the butter in there and it slid around the pan and everybody was happy. Who knew, right?
Right.
Who knew?
Right.
So if I am frying an egg in my Teflon pan, do I have to be concerned about that too?
I mean, if you still have a Teflon pan, you may want to consider replacing it.
I don't do the cooking in my household, so I don't know. But we have non-stick pans. I guess maybe they're not Teflon.
There's something else now.
There's something else. Okay, there I am. I am revealing my gross ignorance on the subject of cookware because I don't know. But I do remember the Teflon. We do have a couple of non-stick pans, and I'm sure that whatever it is, it must be current technology. So I guess I'm okay. So we're getting down.
Can I chip in a little bit on this?
This is your show. Go right ahead.
And then if you need to cut me off, by all means,
No,
please do.
go ahead.
So you can still actually buy Teflon products today. So if you go to like Demoulas, let's say, you can still buy Scotch Guard to, protect your couch. So
Okay.
Teflon products haven't been totally outlawed yet. And so we're still going through that process.
Is that the direction that maybe the government is moving in? Do we know?
We hope so.
Okay.
We hope so.
All right.
But that process takes a few years.
Yes.
So the process
The speed of government, as my friend John McDonough says, right? Things
Takes
move
time.
Things move at the speed of government.
The other thing I would say is, it's in our drinking water, but I would say it is ubiquitous. And to give you a feel, even if you get rainwater, there is PFOS and PFO in the rainwater
In the rainwater.
at anywhere between, depending on what you read in the literature, between non-detect to 10 parts per trillion. And part of that is, to give you a feel, do you remember the old acid rain?
I certainly
issue?
do. Anybody who, I've experienced that on automobiles, yes.
So you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Well, before we knew necessarily what we were doing is when you took municipal waste and burnt it, if you didn't burn it at a high enough temperature, you would not destruct the PFOS and PFOA compounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so those compounds got high into the stratosphere and they went everywhere. So the problem is something that's been brewing for many, many decades. And we're just starting to get our hands around it now.
Like so many other things.
Yeah.
That's exactly right, as we gather knowledge. Well, Andy, the time goes fast. It's a half-hour show. We've got about 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with?
No, I would just say that the district's being very proactive. You know where to reach us. We're happy to answer any questions. Many of you have called us, and we hope to continue to give you more information as we know it.
Can you give the website? Maybe it's on your letter here.
If you actually just Google Chelmsford Water District,
That's it, just
it will be
Google
the first one to come up on your search engine.
I stopped saving bookmarks a long time ago. I'm not the sharpest guy in the world when it comes to internet stuff, but I finally figured out that I just need to Google something and, it'll usually come up. You don't have to go through the process of trying to save all the web addresses. Well, this has been very informative. I think the takeaway here is that the Chelmsford Water District is being as diligent as they possibly can be with regard to the PFAS problem. I think they're on top of it. Certainly our other water districts are on top of it as well. And when you get these kinds of advisories, this is low-level concern. This one that we just got. It's concerning, but it's low-level concern. If you have questions, anything you don't understand when you get any communication from the water district or any government entity for that matter, pick up the phone, call, ask questions. You might want to start out with the website. But, and the folks at the Chelmsford Water District are very accommodating. They're very professional folks, and they will absolutely answer your questions and take as much time as they need to allay whatever concerns you may have relative to this problem. So Andy, thank you very much
Thank you for having us.
for being on the show, and we'll certainly have you back.